Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So it's been almost a month now since the federal election, and Parliament still hasn't come back, but that doesn't mean there isn't a lot to catch up on. What was supposed to be a transformative election ended with not much changing at all, and arguably with no party getting what they wanted. And so for the last few weeks, the parties have been in a period of self-reflection, asking themselves where they went wrong and how much of the blame lies with their leaders.
What we're hearing this time is that the people who are frustrated by Aaron O'Toole's decision to bring the party closer to the center during the campaign is that they want to make sure they understand who would actually be running to replace him if they do move to oust him.
Parliamentary reporter Marieke Walsh is on the show today, and she's going to bring us up to speed on the discussions happening in Ottawa and what to expect when Parliament is back in session. You're listening to The Decibel. Hey, Marieke, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for doing this.
Hi, Tamara. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the Liberals, who managed to hold on to government but failed to get the majority they were hoping for. It's been a few weeks now, so how is the party looking back on their results?
What's interesting is they are actually moving the slowest in having a look back at the results, at least from what we have heard. So all of the parties have now had some sort of meeting with their elected MPs, but the Liberals are the only ones to not yet hold what they're calling a formal caucus meeting. They had an informal gathering, they said last week, to sort of send off their defeated MPs and thank them, but they haven't yet started that process of setting up caucus, electing a caucus chair for this new session of Parliament. We do know that the Liberals are expecting to have an election review that includes their caucus. Ontario MP Mark Garretson spoke with us after their informal gathering last week and said that he does expect there to be a review and a look back at the election. And he said one of his key concerns is that the parties really struggled and lost ground in rural Canada. And so there is now a greater divide in urban and rural Canada when it comes to where Liberal MPs are sitting.
Do you have a sense of why there is that delay and they haven't started any kind of official review process?
They seem to be really taking their time in resetting since the election, which I think surprised some observers because the message from the Prime Minister on election night was, it's clear you want us to get back to work. And since then, we have seen some very significant announcements. Of course, the vaccine mandates for travelers that were announced last week. And in terms of the cabinet and the next steps, all of those are coming later.
The government has already found itself in the midst of one scandal since the election. So on September 30th, which was the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, the Prime Minister was seen on vacation in Tofino. And he'd been invited to mark the day at a First Nations ceremony near Kamloops. He didn't go to that or any of the other events around Tofino, although he says he did speak with residential school survivors on the phone. And this was also while his public itinerary said that he'd been in private meetings in Ottawa. So he's been criticized a lot for this. And what's been the fallout of that scandal for him?
There's twofold challenge, I think, with that controversy. First of all, and most importantly, I think with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities across Canada, it is really a bridge burned at a moment when it was least expected and when it was so out of step with the government's messaging and rhetoric around the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and it being their most important relationship. And so that is an issue that he will have to address. And we already saw the Kamloops First Nation say that they expect him to visit later this month. And he has apologized to their chief. But certainly it has further tarnished or hurt his image. And the problem for the Prime Minister is that it feeds into a narrative of other missteps and controversies. It adds to this narrative of a lack of judgment.
Mm-hmm. So, we've had John Ibbitson on the podcast a few times, and he's predicted that this would be Trudeau's last election as leader. And he recently wrote a column arguing that the Tofino scandal, along with a lack of fresh initiatives, kind of point to him being gone before the next election. What do you make of that?
Certainly, it is one of the questions being asked, but the longer you are in government, the longer you win elections, or the harder it is to win the next one. And I think, it's, from my perspective, not actually clear what he will do. We have seen that they have really done a lot to elevate the status and the visibility of Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. She was with him at his first press conference after the election. She was with him to announce the vaccine mandates, even though those weren't technically her file. So clearly we are seeing that he is really elevating her position. Who knows what it actually means, but clearly there seems to have been a change, at least in the optics of that part of the government. I think it's too soon to say. The Prime Minister said very clearly he hopes to govern for as long as he is able to in this Parliament. What that means for next steps, but it's certainly something that people in Ottawa are wondering about and talking about in particular, because he was so unable to capitalize on what really looked like the best frame for the Liberals in this election. And that was around the vaccine halo, with everybody getting their vaccinations who wanted them, very high poll numbers, and those kind of elements.
Let's move on to the Conservatives, who were polling very close to the Liberals throughout, but lost in the end. They had their very first caucus meeting since the election on October 5th. And you reported, I think, that they voted to give themselves the power to oust Aaron O'Toole as leader, but that after the meeting, O'Toole himself said that he has the support of the caucus. So what are we supposed to make of that? Like, what's your sense of how frustrated the caucus is with Aaron O'Toole right now?
It's a very interesting strategic move by Aaron O'Toole. He was clear that he was encouraging his caucus, that's his elected members of Parliament, to give themselves the power to oust him. And how that would work is a certain number of MPs would have to sign a public letter calling for a vote, and then the vote among all elected MPs would be held in private on whether he should stay. And the strategic move behind that push from Mr. O'Toole to have caucus give itself that power is that then if they did elect to give themselves this power anyways, he could say he was supporting it. So it didn't look as though it was the first step in a move to oust him. And on top of that, going forward, it means that whenever there are leadership rumblings, or if there are leadership rumblings, he can say, well, caucus has the power to oust me, and they haven't. And so it's a strategic way to try and quell some of those debates that we really saw blow up with Andrew Scheer. On the flip side, he really does now have this short leash that his MPs have given him, because they now do have this power and this control over his tenure and his future as leader if they elect to use it. What I've heard from that first meeting is that people weren't as angry. Tempers weren't running as hot as they were in the first meeting after Andrew Scheer's election loss in 2019. I don't think it's necessarily over yet for him. I don't think he can now say, I'm safe, things are good. There's still going to be a leadership review. What we're hearing this time is that the people who are frustrated by Aaron O'Toole's decision to bring the party closer to the center during the campaign is that they want to make sure they understand who would actually be running to replace him if they do move to oust him.
So a few days after the election, there was a member of the Conservative National Council named Bert Chen who said that a lot of party members are upset with his attempt to make the party more centrist. So is there a reckoning happening inside the party, as far as you know, over the approach Aaron O'Toole took to policy, or is the conversation right now mostly about him as like a leader?
I think it's both, but I think certainly the policy is a big issue. One of the things Shannon Stubbs from Alberta, who spoke with reporters before the caucus meeting last week, she emphasized the need to run as a conservative and to win in urban areas as a conservative. And so she wasn't explicitly saying that Aaron O'Toole wasn't a conservative, but we know that from his leadership campaign, where he ran as a, quote, true blue conservative, where he was to the right in that leadership campaign of Peter MacKay, he now dramatically shifted the party to the center during the campaign and really tried to rebrand the party in the campaign rather than laying the groundwork beforehand. And so from what I've heard, the job for Aaron O'Toole right now is ensuring caucus is on side and ensuring any fractures within that are healed.
Let's talk about the NDP for a second. So much like the Liberals and the Conservatives, not much really changed for the NDP. They gained one seat and they're still in a decent position to hold the Liberals to the policies that they agree on. But there was a lot of hope before the election that this would be the NDP's moment, that they would be able to seize the opportunity to make a bunch of gains. Obviously, that didn't happen. What have you heard about where they think they went wrong?
The biggest takeaway I've heard from really the senior leaders of the NDP's campaign is that their get out the vote strategy, so that day of hard push where you need volunteers on the ground, knocking on doors, calling people, ensuring they're actually leaving their houses, leaving their cell phones to go and vote, is where they fell short. They believe they ran a strong campaign. It was focused on Jagmeet Singh as the leader. They focused squarely on contrasting Jagmeet Singh with Justin Trudeau, and they more strongly, I would say, attacked Justin Trudeau than we've seen in the past. And the difference that I've heard is that the Liberal machine, the get out the vote machine and volunteer base just won the day in those tight ridings that we saw in places like Toronto and in places like BC, where it was difficult for the NDP to get out the vote enough to beat those tight races. And when somebody's losing, by a couple hundred votes, it's actually what you hear from political campaigners. Those are the toughest losses. Because you could have found those voters if you had the get out the vote machine. It's when you lose in a landslide that you know that what you did wouldn't have made a difference. The challenge for the NDP now is that while they hold enough votes to hold the balance of power in government, so does the Bloc Québécois and so does the Conservatives. The Liberals have options, which is why they have such a strong minority mandate.
This is Jagmeet Singh's second election as NDP leader, and he was praised a lot this time around for being more comfortable in the role and for being a very effective campaigner. So it sounds like people aren't blaming him for the lack of results, right? Like, what is the conversation right now about him staying on as leader?
There seems to be no question at all about him staying on as leader. And part of that is because the NDP also do just give their leaders more time than other parties do. And, Jack Layton is remembered for his 2011 Orange Crush, but there were several elections that led to that beforehand, right? And that's what they point to.
Okay, and then we should talk a little bit about the Greens. A lot of stuff has happened since Annamie Paul's resignation. So for people who weren't really following that, tell me about the aftermath of her resignation and how the parties responded to it.
I think the aftermath suggests that it's still a party in chaos and divided. Annamie Paul is still the leader of the Green Party, despite stepping down in September. The party has not yet announced the start of a leadership election, they have not yet appointed an interim leader because she still is the leader. So clearly there are still challenges in just the governance and organization of the party. And more than that, they have a real question, I think, about the core raison d'etre of the party. Mm-hmm. If voters no longer see them as being the party to push Canada towards stronger climate change action, or why is it that they've ceded that ground, it appears, to parties like the Liberals? I mean, during the campaign, we saw the former BC Green Party leader endorsing the Liberal Party's plan. And we also know that the Greens did not talk about climate nearly as much. And that kind of is also a carryover, to be honest, from the 2019 campaign, where they tried to broaden their policy proposals and their policy pitch to voters to make them more accessible and not just a one-note party. But the question is, what role are they then playing in Canadian politics and in the House of Commons? Okay,
so from the outside looking in, it really does kind of look like the party's in shambles, and like
I don't think that's wrong.
Yeah, and Elizabeth May, she said that she felt like she had to speak out so that the public could understand what was going on and like to hear from the other side. But is it possible for them to come back from this? Like, what do you think about the state of the Green Party and where it's going?
I think that's the $1 million question. I think it goes back to what their role, what they add to Canadian politics is, what they want that to be. When we first talked about the Green Party on the pod a few months back, we were talking about how this dispute over Middle East policy was blowing up a Green Party that is supposed to be focused on climate change. And really, in the best of times, most voters in Canada don't vote on foreign policy. So to see this just completely be sidetracked and to be derailed by an issue that is not top of mind for most voters, especially in the middle of a pandemic, was, I think, very befuddling for people and for voters. And the fact that she didn't run a national campaign, the fact that she was so stymied to run her own campaign by the party, that she was embroiled in legal issues with her own party. There are so many questions, both about the party's governance, about the party's pitch to voters, what it's doing for voters, what role it has. But then on the flip side, it still has 2 MPs in the House of Commons. So even though their vote share tumbled across the country, Elizabeth May won and Mike Morris won in Ontario. And so it's not as though they won't have a voice in Parliament. The question is, how do they use that voice? And how much will people be turning to those MPs to hear their perspective when their own party is in such disarray? And I think that question is still an open-ended, unanswered question, in part because the party has not yet actually launched the next steps of replacing a leader. Certainly, we know after Elizabeth May resigned in 2019 that there was a lot of interest in the party, in what the party would bring. And Anne-Marie Paul's election, turned a lot of heads in Ottawa and also concerned some NDP strategists and Liberal strategists who saw her power and her command of a room, which I think some voters saw in the debate during the election. But she was just missing so many other elements. She didn't have the support from her party to help her get those elements. And she lacked a really a professional team around her of strategists that just seems to have really hindered her ability to make the most of the position she was in.
And just to wrap this up, when can we expect Parliament to come back?
The Prime Minister gave himself a lot of leeway on that one when he told us, he said that Parliament will resume before the end of fall, which is just before Christmas on December 21st. So we've got 2.5 months in that window to find out when when he comes back and when MPs will get back to work. He has already laid out the agenda, and we know the government will need to act quickly on addressing whether to extend the pandemic supports for businesses and individuals, because those are expiring this month. We also know that they will be seized by the climate change negotiations in Glasgow later this month and into November. And of course, he's going to set out his cabinet, which I think really is the number one challenge inside government right now, is figuring out the geographic breakdown, the gender parity, as well as reflecting the geography of the country, the geography of where the Liberals won more seats in BC, for example, and of course, ensuring there are a diversity of voices. So there is a huge sort of strategic puzzle game being played in the Prime Minister's office right now.
Okay, excited to see what happens. Thank you, Marieke.
Thanks, Tamara.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. Michal Stein edited this episode. David Crosby edits the show, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Marieke Walsh. You can find her on Twitter at Marieke Walsh. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.